April 30th, 1943, 1,600 yards off the Spanish coast. A British submarine surfaces in darkness and releases something into the Atlantic. Not a weapon, but a corpse. Chained to his wrist, a briefcase containing invasion plans for Greece and Sardinia. His name, Major William Martin, Royal Marines. His mission, to lie so convincingly that Nazi Germany would believe him. Except Major William Martin never existed. The body was real. Glyndwr Michael, a 34-year-old homeless Welshman who died from rat poison in a London morgue. But British intelligence officers Ewan Montagu and Charles Cholmondeley had transformed him. Fake fiancé letters, theater ticket stubs, an overdraft notice, even an engagement ring receipt. Every detail designed to deceive Adolf Hitler himself. The stakes: 160,000 Allied troops preparing to invade Sicily. If the Germans discovered the truth, they'd reinforce the island with panzer divisions. If they believed the lie, they'd send those tanks somewhere else. Within 48 hours, German intelligence found the body. 12 days later, Hitler ordered the 1st Panzer Division, 15,000 men, 200 tanks, diverted to Greece. A homeless man who owned nothing in life was about to save thousands of soldiers he would never meet. But could a dead man's lie really fool the most powerful military machine in Europe? Before we begin, hit subscribe to help preserve the stories that history almost forgot, the details that textbooks left out, but that decided everything. And drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these untold missions reach. January 1943. The war rooms beneath Whitehall in London hummed with the low murmur of planning staffs hunched over maps that stretched across oak tables scarred by 3 years of crisis. Outside, Britain endured its 4th winter of total war. Inside these windowless chambers, 42 officers from British intelligence, Royal Navy Planning, and Combined Operations Headquarters confronted a problem that had no precedent and no margin for error. On the central table lay a map of the Mediterranean marked with colored pins representing Allied and Axis divisions. The pins told a story that terrified every man in the room. North Africa had fallen to the Allies in November 1942 after brutal campaigns at El Alamein and Operation Torch. General Eisenhower commanded over 500,000 troops in Tunisia and Algeria. Prime Minister Churchill and President Roosevelt had already agreed at the Casablanca Conference that the next step was Sicily, Operation Husky, the first major Allied invasion of Axis-held Europe since Dunkirk. The invasion date was set for July 10, 1943, just 6 months away. Intelligence estimates projected 160,000 Allied troops, 3,000 ships and 4,000 aircraft converging on an island defended by 230,000 Italian troops and at least 30,000 Germans, including the elite Hermann Göring Panzer Division. The mathematics were brutal. If the Germans knew the invasion was coming, and they almost certainly did, because Sicily was the only logical target, they would reinforce the island with additional panzer divisions from France and Greece. British planners estimated 10,000 Allied casualties in the first week alone if the enemy was fully prepared and dug in along the invasion beaches. Lieutenant Commander Ewan Montagu stood at the edge of the map table, his Navy uniform crisp despite the late hour. At 42, Montagu was a peacetime barrister who had volunteered for naval intelligence in 1939. He possessed no combat experience and had never commanded a warship, but he had something more valuable in this particular war: a mind trained to construct airtight legal arguments and dismantle lies. Beside him stood Flight Lieutenant Charles Cholmondeley of the Royal Air Force, 26 years old, tall and awkward, a man whose pre-war career in advertising had taught him how to sell ideas that didn't exist. Together, they represented Section 17M of British Naval Intelligence, a unit so obscure that most officers in the building couldn't say what the M stood for. It stood for Montagu. His section had one mandate: deceive the enemy on a strategic scale. Their superior, Rear Admiral John Godfrey, Director of Naval Intelligence, posed the question that had paralyzed planners for weeks. How do you hide the most obvious invasion in history? Sicily wasn't a surprise. German intelligence officers in Rome and Berlin were already moving units into position. Reconnaissance flights over North African ports had photographed the massive buildup of landing craft, the telltale signature of amphibious assault. The German High Command knew an invasion was coming. They knew it would be somewhere in the Mediterranean, and every piece of logic pointed directly at Sicily. Cholmondeley had been thinking about this problem for months, ever since the 20 Committee, Britain's Master Deception Board, codenamed XEX for the double-cross system, had tasked Section 17M with creating a strategic deception plan for Husky. He had combed through old intelligence files looking for unconventional ideas that earlier planners had dismissed as too risky or too strange. In October 1942, he found something buried in the archives from 1939. It was called the Trojan Horse Memorandum, written by a young assistant to Admiral Godfrey named Ian Fleming. The proposal was as simple as it was macabre. Plant false documents on a dead body. Dress the corpse as a military courier. Let it wash ashore in neutral territory where German intelligence operates. If the deception is convincing enough, the enemy will intercept the documents and believe them. Fleming had never tested the idea. In 1939, Britain was still fighting a traditional war with traditional methods, but by January 1943, traditional methods had killed hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers, and the planners in Whitehall were desperate enough to consider anything that might shift the odds. Cholmondeley brought the memorandum to Montagu on January 4, 1943. They read it together in Montagu's cramped office on the third floor of the Admiralty building. The concept was audacious and legally questionable. Using a corpse without family consent violated British law. Falsifying military documents could be considered treason if the operation failed and the papers fell into the wrong hands. But the strategic potential was undeniable. If German intelligence believed the false documents, they might divert divisions away from Sicily to defend other targets. Even a single panzer division moved out of position could save thousands of Allied lives on the invasion beaches. Montagu made his decision in less than 10 minutes. He would present the plan to the 20 Committee and request authorization to proceed. Within 72 hours, Montagu stood before the committee in a secure briefing room and laid out the operation. He proposed using a corpse dressed as a Royal Marine officer carrying faked letters from senior British commanders indicating that the next Allied invasion would target Greece and Sardinia, not Sicily. The body would be released off the coast of Spain near Huelva, a port known to be crawling with German agents. Spanish authorities, though officially neutral, routinely passed intelligence to the Abwehr, German military intelligence. If the deception worked, the false invasion plans would reach Berlin within days. The 20 committee members listened in silence. These were not sentimental men. They had run double agents, fabricated intelligence networks, and orchestrated deceptions that had already cost enemy lives. But this proposal crossed a line no one had tested. They were asking Nazi Germany to believe a dead man. The chairman of the committee, John Masterman, asked the only question that mattered. If the Germans discover this is fake, what happens to Operation Husky? Montagu's answer was blunt. If they discover it, we've lost nothing except one corpse and some paper. But if they don't discover it, we may divert entire divisions away from the real invasion. The Germans will believe it because we'll make the details so perfect they'll have no reason to doubt. Every document, every personal item, every aspect of the dead man's identity will be authentic enough to survive German counterintelligence scrutiny. The committee voted to approve the plan with one absolute condition. Every detail must be flawless. One inconsistency, one suspicious element, and the entire operation collapses. Worse, if the Germans suspect deception, they may reinforce Sicily even more heavily, assuming the Allies are trying to misdirect them. The margin for error was zero. Montagu left the briefing room on January 8, 1943, with authorization to proceed and an impossible deadline. The corpse had to reach Spain by late April, 10 weeks before the Sicily invasion, to give German intelligence time to analyze the documents and redeploy forces. He had no body, no identity, no forged documents, and no operational plan for getting a corpse into enemy hands without British involvement being detected. He had 4 months to build a ghost convincing enough to fool Adolf Hitler. The hunt for a body began in the cold storage vaults of London's municipal morgues. Montague contacted coroner Bentley Purchase at St. Pancras Mortuary on January 15, 1943, with requirements that were as precise as they were disturbing. The corpse had to be male, relatively young, and dead from causes that could plausibly mimic drowning or exposure at sea. It could not show signs of violence, disease, or decomposition that would raise suspicion during autopsy. Most critically, the body had to be unclaimed, no family, no next of kin, no one who would ask questions or demand answers. Purchase understood immediately that this was not a standard wartime requisition. He asked no questions. In a city where German bombers had killed over 40,000 civilians and where hundreds of unidentified bodies passed through the morgue system each month, finding an unclaimed corpse was tragically routine. What made this request unusual was the specification about cause of death. Montague needed someone who had died in a way that Spanish pathologists would mistake for drowning without conducting extensive chemical analysis. Purchase found the answer in his records from 6 weeks earlier. On January 24, 1943, a 34-year-old homeless man named Glyndwr Michael had been brought to St. Pancras after ingesting rat poison near King's Cross Station. Michael had died from phosphorus poisoning, a slow and agonizing death that caused fluid buildup in the lungs. The medical effect mimicked pulmonary edema, the same condition found in drowning victims. A Spanish coroner examining the body weeks after death would see fluid in the lungs and likely conclude the man had drowned at sea without performing deeper toxicology tests that might reveal the poison. Michael had been living rough in London for months, estranged from family in Wales, unemployed and unknown. No one had claimed the body. No funeral arrangements had been made. The City of London planned to bury him in an unmarked pauper's grave within days. Purchase called Montague on February 4th. He had a candidate. Montague and Cholmondeley drove to St. Pancras that afternoon and viewed the body in the mortuary's refrigeration unit. Glyndwr Michael had been dead for 11 days. The cold storage had preserved him, but time was already working against the deception. The body would need to appear recently drowned, not weeks old. Montague consulted with Sir Bernard Spilsbury, Britain's most famous forensic pathologist, who had testified in hundreds of murder trials and understood decomposition rates with scientific precision. Spilsbury examined Michael's body and delivered his assessment with clinical detachment. If kept at sub-zero temperatures and released into water within 3 months, the body would still appear consistent with a man who had been in the sea for several days. The phosphorus poisoning would not be detectable without chemical analysis that Spanish authorities were unlikely to perform. Spilsbury saw no medical reason the deception would fail. Montague authorized Purchase to transfer the body into military custody under absolute secrecy. Michael's death certificate was quietly amended. Cause of death remained listed as chemical poisoning, but the body was reclassified as claimed by family. In reality, it was transported to a private mortuary facility in Hackney, controlled by British intelligence and placed in a specialized refrigeration unit designed for long-term storage. Glyndwr Michael, who had owned nothing and mattered to no one, had just become the most important corpse in the European theater. While the body remained frozen in Hackney, Montague and Cholmondeley began constructing the ghost. They named him Major William Martin, serial number 14828, Royal Marines, temporarily attached to Combined Operations Headquarters. The identity was chosen carefully. Royal Marines officers frequently carried classified documents as couriers between headquarters. A major was senior enough to be trusted with important papers, but junior enough that German intelligence wouldn't expect his name to appear in standard reference materials. The serial number was genuine, pulled from a real Royal Marine who had died months earlier in a training accident. If German intelligence checked the number against captured records or interrogated British prisoners of war, it would match. The rank and unit would verify. Only the name and assignment were fabricated. The construction of Major Martin's life consumed 6 weeks of meticulous work. Montague assembled a team of intelligence clerks, forgers, and researchers who understood that every detail had to withstand German scrutiny. They started with identity documents. Martin needed a military paybook, stamped and signed by a commanding officer. He needed an identity card with photograph. He needed a security pass for Combined Operations Headquarters, the most restricted facility in London. Each document had to show appropriate wear, edge fraying, pocket creasing, water staining from Atlantic spray. The forgery team aged the documents in salt water, bent and folded them repeatedly, and exposed them to controlled amounts of sunlight to fade the ink to realistic levels. The photograph was particularly challenging. They couldn't use Glyndwr Michael's face because his appearance in death wouldn't match a living portrait. Instead, they selected a staff officer from Welsh intelligence who bore a passing resemblance to Michael and photographed him in civilian clothes. The image was deliberately slightly out of focus, the kind of quick portrait taken at a chemist's shop for official documents. Martin needed a personal history that would create emotional resonance. Intelligence officers understand that German counterintelligence doesn't just check facts, they look for human patterns, the small details that prove a person lived. Cholmondeley invented a fiancée. Her name was Pam. She existed nowhere except in 2 letters placed in Martin's pocket, written on civilian stationery in feminine handwriting by a female intelligence clerk. The letters were masterpieces of mundane intimacy. Pam wrote about missing him, about planning their wedding, about her father's disapproval of the engagement, about a recent argument they'd had before he shipped out. One letter mentioned a photograph she had enclosed, a portrait of herself that intelligence officers obtained by recruiting a young female clerk who agreed to pose as the fictional Pam. The photograph was slightly creased, as if Martin had carried it for weeks and looked at it often. In Martin's wallet, the team placed additional evidence of this relationship: a receipt from a London jeweler for an engagement ring dated 3 weeks earlier, 2 ticket stubs from a West End theater performance of a popular comedy, an overdraft notice from Lloyd's Bank showing Martin was overdrawn by £19, the kind of financial strain a young officer buying an engagement ring might face. Even the wallet itself was carefully selected, worn leather, British military issue, with a patina of months of use. The critical element was the letters Martin would carry. These had to be correspondence between senior British commanders discussing strategic plans, written in a tone casual enough to seem authentic but detailed enough to convince German intelligence that they had intercepted genuine Allied invasion planning. Montagu drafted 2 letters. The first was supposedly from Lieutenant General Archibald Nye, Vice Chief of the Imperial General Staff, to General Harold Alexander, Commander of Allied Ground Forces in Tunisia. The letter discussed upcoming operations in the Mediterranean and referenced Allied plans to invade Greece and Sardinia while using Sicily as a deceptive feint. The second letter was from Lord Louis Mountbatten, Chief of Combined Operations, introducing Major Martin as a courier delivering Nye's letter and discussing minor administrative matters. Both letters were typed on authentic military stationery that intelligence had carefully stockpiled. The signatures were forged by expert document specialists who had practiced reproducing Nye's and Mountbatten's handwriting for weeks. The letters were folded, placed in official envelopes, and sealed with wax stamps bearing correct military insignia. By mid-April, Major William Martin existed as completely as any living officer in the British military. His entire fabricated life fit into a briefcase and 2 pockets, but those items represented hundreds of hours of intelligence work and psychological calculation. On April 17th, Montagu made a final inspection of everything that would go into the water with Glyndwr Michael's body. He checked each document against a verification list. 28 separate items, each designed to prove that Major Martin was real and his mission was genuine. The body was removed from refrigeration and dressed in full Royal Marine battle dress, including boots, service cap, and a Mae West life jacket. The briefcase containing the false letters was attached to Martin's wrist with a chain and lock, standard procedure for classified courier duty. Everything was ready. The operation had a name now: Mincemeat, and Mincemeat had 8 days to reach the Spanish coast before the invasion timeline made the deception irrelevant. HMS Seraph departed Holy Loch, Scotland on April 19, 1943, under sealed orders that even her commanding officer had not been permitted to read until the submarine cleared British territorial waters. Lieutenant Norman Jewell, 30 years old and already a veteran of 18 combat patrols in the Mediterranean, commanded one of the Royal Navy's most experienced submarine crews. Seraph had carried out covert operations before, landing commando teams on occupied coastlines, conducting reconnaissance missions off enemy harbors, inserting intelligence agents into North Africa ahead of Operation Torch. But the steel canister loaded into the forward torpedo room on departure morning was marked with stenciled letters that told Jewell nothing. Optical instruments. Handle with care. The canister was 7 feet long, cylindrical, and sealed with bolted caps at both ends. It weighed approximately 200 pounds and had been delivered to the dock under armed guard by 2 officers from Naval Intelligence who refused to answer questions. Jewell's orders were explicit. Transport the canister to a designated point off the southern coast of Spain near the port of Huelva. Surface before dawn on April 30th. Open the canister and release its contents into the water at precisely calculated coordinates that would allow tidal currents to carry the object ashore. Then depart immediately and maintain absolute radio silence until returning to base. Jewell opened his sealed orders on April 20th, once Seraph had submerged and begun the voyage south through the Atlantic. The orders clarified nothing. The canister contained materials related to a classified intelligence operation. Jewell was not to inspect the contents. He was not to discuss the mission with his crew beyond what was operationally necessary. The success of an unnamed military operation depended entirely on this object reaching Spanish territorial waters without British involvement being detected. Jewell understood that the Royal Navy did not dispatch submarines and experienced crews on delivery missions unless the cargo mattered more than the ship carrying it. He briefed his officers that afternoon in the submarine's cramped wardroom. They were transporting classified material that needed to reach neutral territory. The crew would be told it was meteorological equipment being deployed for weather research. No one was to approach the canister or speculate about its contents. Violations of operational security would result in courts-martial. The officers nodded. They had worked with Jewell long enough to recognize when orders came from higher authority than mere submarine command. Seraph traveled submerged during daylight hours, surfacing only at night to recharge batteries and ventilate the boat. The voyage took 11 days, threading carefully through shipping lanes and avoiding German patrol aircraft operating from bases in France and Spain. By April 28th, Seraph had reached the approaches to the Gulf of Cadiz, staying well outside Spanish territorial waters while Jewell finalized his approach plan. The target coordinates were 1,600 yards offshore from Huelva, close enough that tidal currents would carry the object to the beach, but far enough out that Spanish coast watchers wouldn't observe a submarine on the surface. Montague had selected Huelva with deliberate precision. The port was officially neutral but known to British intelligence as a hotbed of German espionage. The Abwehr maintained active networks throughout southern Spain, and local Spanish officials routinely cooperated with German agents in exchange for intelligence sharing that benefited Spain's own security apparatus. More importantly, Huelva's chief pathologist was known through intelligence reports to be friendly with German contacts and unlikely to perform thorough autopsies on foreign bodies that washed ashore. If Major Martin's corpse landed at Huelva, German intelligence would hear about it within hours. April 30th there arrived with clear skies and calm seas, conditions that made Jewell nervous. Submarine operations preferred rough weather and poor visibility that concealed surface activity from shore observation posts. But the tidal calculations were precise. The body had to enter the water during a specific window when currents would carry it northeast toward Huelva's beaches. Delay meant missing that window and potentially having the corpse drift south into the open Atlantic or wash ashore at an unmonitored location where Spanish authorities might simply bury it without reporting anything to German intelligence. At 04:30 hours, with darkness still covering the coast, Seraph surfaced. Jewell had finally been briefed on the canister's contents the previous evening by secure radio message from London. He now understood he was about to commit a corpse to the sea as part of an intelligence deception operation. The revelation changed nothing about his orders, but it gave context to the absolute secrecy that surrounded the mission. The canister was brought up from the torpedo room by 4 crew members who struggled with its awkward weight in the confined space of the submarine's interior. Jewell had selected only men he trusted completely, sailors who had proven their discretion on previous covert operations. They hauled the canister onto the forward deck while Seraph maintained position, her diesel engines idling quietly to hold station against the current. The night was absolutely still. No lights showed on the Spanish coast. No aircraft sounds disturbed the silence. Jewell ordered the canister opened. The crew unscrewed the bolted caps using tools that had been provided with the container. Inside, packed in dry ice that had kept the contents frozen during the 11-day voyage, lay the body of Major William Martin. The corpse was dressed in full Royal Marine battle dress uniform, the fabric still damp from pre-soaking, designed to simulate immersion. A Mae West life jacket was strapped around the torso, partially inflated to provide buoyancy. The briefcase was secured to the left wrist with a chain and combination lock. In the pockets, wallet, identity documents, letters, keys, personal effects. Everything that would prove Major Martin had been a living officer on classified courier duty when his aircraft went down in the Atlantic. Jewell had served in the Royal Navy for 12 years and commanded submarines through some of the worst fighting of the war, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for the surreal horror of this moment. He was about to throw a dead man into the ocean and hope the enemy believed the lie attached to his wrist. The body was lifted carefully from the canister and positioned at the edge of the deck. One of the crew members, a devout Catholic from Liverpool, asked quietly if they should say something. Jewell pulled a small prayer book from his jacket and read Psalm 39, verse 4. "Lord, let me know mine end and the number of my days, that I may be certified how long I have to live." The words took less than 30 seconds. At 04:45 hours, Jewell gave the order. The crew released the body into the Atlantic. Major William Martin slipped beneath the surface, buoyed by the Mae West, and began drifting with the current toward the Spanish coast. Seraph's crew watched for a moment as the body floated away in the darkness, a pale shape against black water, until Jewell ordered them below. The submarine crash dove to 60 feet and turned west, running submerged toward Gibraltar. Within 15 minutes, Seraph was 3 miles from the drop point and increasing speed. Jewell transmitted a brief coded message to London via underwater antenna. Mincemeat completed. The body was in the water. Now everything depended on whether a Spanish fisherman would find it, whether Spanish authorities would notify German intelligence, and whether the Abwehr would believe that Major William Martin had died carrying secrets that could change the course of the war. At 09:30 hours on April 30th, José Antonio Rey Maria, a sardine fisherman working the waters off Punta Umbria near Huelva, spotted something floating 200 yards from his boat. He rowed closer and found the body of a man in military uniform, face down in the water, a briefcase chained to his wrist. Rey Maria hauled the corpse into his boat and rowed immediately to shore, where he reported the discovery to the Spanish Coast Guard. Within an hour, the body was transferred to Huelva's naval headquarters. By noon, the briefcase and its contents were in the hands of Spanish naval intelligence. By nightfall, German agents in Huelva had been informed that a British officer carrying classified documents had washed ashore. Glyndwr Michael had been dead for 3 months. Major William Martin's mission had just begun. The silence that followed was worse than any combat Montague had experienced in 3 years of intelligence work. On May 1, 1943, the British naval attaché in Madrid sent a brief encrypted cable to London confirming that Spanish authorities had recovered a body matching the description of a Royal Marine officer and that personal effects were being examined by local officials. The message contained no details about the briefcase or the documents it contained. For the next 11 days, Montague sat in his Whitehall office and waited for confirmation that would never come directly. He could not ask the Spanish government about the documents without revealing British interest in them, which would instantly expose the deception. He could not send agents to investigate without risking German counterintelligence detecting unusual British activity around Huelva. The entire operation now rested on German intelligence doing exactly what Montague had predicted they would do: intercept the documents, photograph them, analyze them, and forward them to Berlin. If the Germans ignored the papers, or if Spanish authorities simply returned everything to the British embassy without opening the briefcase, Operation Mincemeat would fail silently, and the Sicily invasion would proceed with no deceptive cover whatsoever. British intelligence had one advantage the Germans did not know existed. Since 1940, cryptanalysts at Bletchley Park had been breaking German Enigma codes through a program codenamed Ultra. The intelligence intercepts from Ultra were so sensitive that only a handful of senior British and American commanders knew the system existed. Churchill himself had ordered that Ultra intelligence could never be acted upon in ways that might alert the Germans their communications were compromised. Montagu had access to Ultra intercepts related to German intelligence operations, but those intercepts only revealed what the Abwehr was saying in encrypted radio traffic. If the Germans examined the mincemeat documents and simply filed a report through courier rather than radio, Montagu would learn nothing until it was too late to matter. He checked the Ultra summaries twice daily, scanning through reports of German military communications across every theater, searching for any reference to documents recovered in Spain or intelligence regarding Allied invasion plans in the Mediterranean. May 4th brought the first hint of success. An Ultra intercept revealed that the German embassy in Madrid had reported to Berlin the recovery of a British courier's body off the Spanish coast. The message was brief and contained no details about documents, but it confirmed German intelligence was aware of the incident. Montagu read the decrypt 3 times, looking for anything that suggested skepticism or suspicion. The tone was routine, the kind of administrative notification that intelligence services send when foreign military personnel turn up dead in neutral territory. Nothing in the language indicated the Germans suspected deception. On May 7th, a second intercept appeared. The Abwehr station in Madrid had obtained photographs of documents recovered from the British officer's briefcase. The intercept mentioned letters from senior British commanders but did not specify content. Montagu felt the first surge of cautious optimism. The Germans had the documents. They were important enough to photograph and report. The operation had cleared its first critical threshold. May 12th brought confirmation that changed everything. Ultra intercepted a message from Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, head of the Abwehr, to Oberkommando der Wehrmacht headquarters in Berlin. The message confirmed that documents recovered in Spain indicated Allied invasion plans targeting Greece and Sardinia. Canaris reported that the letters appeared genuine and recommended they be treated as reliable intelligence regarding Allied intentions in the Mediterranean. The intercept was 9 lines long and represented 3 months of Montagu's work compressed into a brief assessment that the enemy believed Major William Martin was real and his mission was legitimate. Montagu brought the decrypt to the 20 committee that afternoon. The room went silent as the members read Canaris's message. They had deceived the head of German military intelligence, but deceiving Canaris was not the same as deceiving Adolf Hitler. On May 14th, Ultra intercepted a communication that exceeded Montagu's most optimistic projections. Hitler had been personally briefed on the documents recovered in Spain. The Führer assessed the intelligence as authentic and ordered immediate defensive measures. German High Command was to reinforce Greece and Sardinia in anticipation of Allied invasion. Sicily was to be treated as a potential diversionary target, but not the primary Allied objective. The intercept included specific orders. The 1st Panzer Division, currently held in reserve in southern France, was to redeploy immediately to Greece. Luftwaffe squadrons in Sicily were to be repositioned to support Greek defenses. Coastal fortifications in Sardinia were to receive priority for additional artillery and garrison troops. Hitler's orders were unequivocal. The documents found on Major Martin represented genuine Allied planning, and German forces would reposition accordingly. Montagu sat alone in his office that evening and tried to comprehend what had just happened. A homeless man who died from rat poison in a London slum had just convinced Adolf Hitler to move an entire Panzer Division. 15,000 German soldiers, 200 tanks, hundreds of support vehicles, and thousands of tons of ammunition were about to board trains heading to Greece instead of reinforcing Sicily. The strategic implications were staggering. Every tank moved to Greece was one fewer tank that Allied troops would face on Sicilian beaches. Every German soldier sent to defend the wrong location was a soldier who could not kill Allied infantry during the actual invasion. But Montagu could not celebrate. Not yet. The Germans might still suspect deception. Hitler's orders might be a counter-deception designed to make the British think they had succeeded, while German forces secretly concentrated on Sicily anyway. Intelligence warfare operated in layers of mirrors where truth and deception became indistinguishable. Montagu needed confirmation that German forces were actually moving, not just that Hitler had ordered them to move. Throughout late May and early June, ultra-intercepts provided that confirmation. German divisional headquarters in southern France reported the 1st Panzer Division had begun rail movement toward Greece. Luftwaffe Command reported squadron redeployments from Sicilian airfields to bases in the Balkans. German naval intelligence requested additional reconnaissance flights over the Greek coast in anticipation of Allied amphibious operations. Every intercepted message reinforced the same conclusion. The Wehrmacht was repositioning based on the mincemeat documents. The deception was not just believed, it was operational. German strategic planning for the Mediterranean had been fundamentally altered by letters written in a London office and carried into the Atlantic on a corpse. But new anxiety emerged to replace the old. Allied intelligence detected that German forces in Sicily were not being weakened as much as Montagu had hoped. While the 1st Panzer Division diverted to Greece, other German units remained on the island. The Hermann Göring Panzer Division, the most powerful German formation in Sicily, stayed in place. Italian coastal divisions continued fortifying beaches. Luftwaffe fighters still operated from Sicilian airfields. The deception had worked, but it had not rendered Sicily undefended. Montagu calculated the impact. If the 1st Panzer Division had reinforced Sicily as originally planned, the invasion would have faced an additional 15,000 German soldiers and 200 tanks. Those forces were now in Greece, completely out of position to effect Operation Husky. But the Sicily invasion would still be opposed by substantial Axis forces. The mincemeat deception had improved Allied odds, but it had not eliminated the threat. June 1943 became a month of agonizing uncertainty. The Sicily invasion was scheduled for July 10th, 5 weeks away. Allied forces in North Africa conducted final preparations. Landing craft assembled in dozens of ports across Tunisia and Algeria. Airborne divisions rehearsed parachute drops. Amphibious assault battalions ran beach landing exercises. The largest invasion fleet since Normandy, though Normandy itself was still a year away, prepared to cross the Mediterranean. Intelligence analysts debated whether the mincemeat deception had achieved sufficient strategic effect or whether German forces in Sicily remained strong enough to turn the beaches into slaughter zones. Churchill pressed Montagu for certainty. Could he guarantee the Germans believed the deception? Montagu's answer was the only honest response he could give. The Germans moved forces based on the documents. Hitler himself issued orders based on Major Martin's briefcase. But intelligence can never provide guarantees, only probabilities. The probability that mincemeat succeeded was high. The probability that Sicily would be easier because of it was real. Whether that translated into thousands of lives saved or merely hundreds would only be known when Allied soldiers hit the beaches and faced whatever resistance waited for them there. July 10, 1943, Aero 2:45 hours. The invasion fleet appeared off Sicily's southern coast in the pre-dawn darkness. 2,590 ships carrying 160,000 Allied troops across a front stretching 80 miles from Cape Passero in the east to Licata in the west. The British Eighth Army under General Bernard Montgomery would land on the southeastern beaches near Syracuse and Pachino. The American Seventh Army under General George Patton would assault the south-central coast near Gela and Skogliti. Overhead, 4,000 aircraft, fighters, bombers, transports carrying paratroopers filled the Mediterranean sky. This was Operation Husky, the largest amphibious invasion attempted in military history to this point. Larger than Torch, larger than Gallipoli, an armada so massive that German reconnaissance had been tracking its assembly for weeks. Every soldier climbing down cargo nets into landing craft understood they were hitting a defended coast where the enemy knew they were coming. The only question was how many Germans would be waiting and how well prepared they would be. The first landing craft touched Sicilian sand at 0310 hours near Pacino on the British sector. Soldiers from the 50th Northumbrian Division waded ashore expecting machine gun fire, artillery bombardment, the grinding chaos of contested beach landings. They found empty pillboxes and abandoned defensive positions. Scattered Italian soldiers surrendered immediately or fled inland. The coastal artillery that intelligence had identified through aerial reconnaissance sat unmanned, its crews evacuated days earlier. By 0400 hours, British forces had secured a beachhead 3 miles deep, with casualties numbering in the dozens rather than the thousands. Montgomery's staff officers, expecting fierce resistance based on pre-invasion intelligence assessments, found themselves advancing against negligible opposition. Something fundamental had changed in the German defensive posture, but in the confusion of the initial landing, no one yet understood what or why. The American landings at Gala encountered heavier resistance. The Hermann Göring Panzer Division, positioned inland near Caltagirone, launched a counterattack against Patton's beachhead on the morning of July 11th. German tanks reached to within a mile of the beach before being stopped by a combination of naval gunfire from destroyers offshore and concentrated artillery from American field guns that had been landed during the night. The battle for Gela lasted 14 hours and cost the Americans over 2,000 casualties, but the beachhead held. By nightfall on July 11th, American forces controlled a coastal perimeter 10 miles wide and were pushing inland. The Hermann Göring Division, bloodied and undersupplied, withdrew north toward the island's interior. The Panzer counterattack that Allied planners had feared most, a coordinated multi-division assault driving the invasion back into the sea, never materialized because the divisions that would have executed that attack were not in Sicily. Within 72 hours of the landing, Allied forces controlled all major ports on Sicily's southern coast. Syracuse fell to British forces on July 12th with minimal fighting. Augusta surrendered on July 13th. American forces captured Licata on July 14th and began pushing west toward Palermo. The Sicilian campaign, projected to take 60 to 90 days of heavy combat, was proceeding faster than the most optimistic Allied estimates. Casualties for the first week totaled approximately 2,000 killed and wounded across both armies, a fraction of the 10,000 estimated for the first week alone. Intelligence officers reviewing battle reports noted a pattern. German resistance was determined where it existed, but German forces were consistently under strength. Units that Allied intelligence had predicted would number in the thousands appeared on the battlefield with only hundreds of men. Artillery support that should have devastated landing beaches was either absent or ineffectively positioned. Most significantly, the reinforcements that German commanders in Sicily repeatedly requested throughout the first 10 days of fighting never arrived. Ultra intercepts revealed why. German high command still believed the Sicily invasion was a diversionary attack preceding a larger Allied landing in Greece or Sardinia. Messages from Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, German commander in Italy, to Wehrmacht headquarters requested immediate reinforcement of Sicily with divisions from Greece and southern France. The responses from Berlin were consistent. Forces could not be diverted from Greece while the threat of Allied invasion remained. Sardinian defenses required additional troops and could not release units to Sicily. The 1st Panzer Division, still positioned in Greece based on Hitler's May orders, would remain there pending clarification of Allied intentions. Kesselring's increasingly desperate. Requests went unmet because German strategic intelligence continued to treat the documents found on Major William Martin as authentic. Even as Allied forces advanced across Sicily, German high command maintained defensive positions in Greece and Sardinia against invasions that would never come. Montague received confirmation of the invasion's progress through official channels and ultra-intercepts throughout July. Each report reinforced what the casualty numbers suggested. The mincemeat deception had worked. German forces that should have been in Sicily were positioned elsewhere. The 1st Panzer Division's 15,000 soldiers and 200 tanks, the force that could have turned the Sicily beaches into killing grounds, remained in Greece until late July, when German command finally acknowledged the documents had been deceptive. By then, Allied forces controlled most of Sicily, and the opportunity to defend the island effectively had passed. Montagu calculated the strategic impact with the same mathematical precision he had used to plan the deception. Approximately 15,000 German soldiers had been kept out of the Sicily campaign. An estimated 5,000 to 7,000 Allied casualties had been prevented by the absence of the 1st Panzer Division from the initial defensive positions. Thousands of soldiers who would have died on Sicilian beaches instead walked inland through abandoned Italian defenses. The cost of saving those lives: one homeless man's body, 28 forged documents, and 4 months of intelligence work. Sicily fell completely to Allied control on August 17, 1943, 38 days after the invasion began. Total Allied casualties for the entire campaign numbered approximately 24,000 killed, wounded, and missing across American, British, and Canadian forces. Pre-invasion estimates had projected 50,000 or more casualties if German defenses were fully prepared. The difference between projection and reality represented the largest successful strategic deception operation executed to that point in the war. British and American intelligence services studied Operation Mincemeat extensively, documenting every element of the deception for future reference. The techniques Montagu developed: identity fabrication, document authentication, psychological manipulation of enemy intelligence analysis, became standard methodology taught at intelligence schools for the next 5 decades. But the man who made it possible received no recognition. Glyndwr Michael's name remained classified until 1996, 53 years after his death. He was buried in Huelva's Nuestra Señora de la Soledad Cemetery under a headstone that read, Major William Martin, Royal Marines, died April 30, 1943, age 36. The grave was maintained by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, and for decades residents of Huelva placed flowers on it, honoring the memory of a British officer who had died carrying out his duty. In 1998, after Michael's true identity was finally declassified, British authorities added a small inscription to the headstone acknowledging that Major William Martin was a fictional identity and that the grave contained Glyndwr Michael, who served Britain in Operation Mincemeat. The flowers continued. Local Spanish residents still tend the grave, unaware that the man buried there was homeless, forgotten, and dead from rat poison before he ever reached their coast. Montagu lived until 1985, long enough to see Operation Mincemeat become declassified and widely studied. He published his account of the operation in 1953 under the title The Man Who Never Was, though he kept Michael's identity secret per government orders. In interviews late in his life, Montagu was asked whether the deception troubled him ethically: using a corpse without family consent, fabricating an identity, manipulating the dead for military advantage. His answer never changed. War requires deception. Deception requires convincing lies. The lie that saved the most lives was the one that convinced Germany a dead man was worth believing. Glyndwr Michael owned nothing in life. In death, he gave thousands of soldiers the only thing that mattered: the chance to go home.